next, we're going to talk to folks from the Connecticut Harm Reduction Alliance. Hi, Alex. So glad you made it. You have a really fascinating program there in Hartford, Connecticut. And this has been a really special program to be a part of and to watch. And I'm sure our listeners will be equally impressed. I'm wondering if we could just start and you tell us a little bit, what are you addressing through your crisis response teams?
So what we're addressing specifically are overdoses, specifically for opiates. Ideally, the realistic part of it is that we're responding to drug ingestions or unconscious folks. So how it comes in is kind of varied. Sometimes we might get someone calling in for like a drug ingestion where they're worried that this person is going to be a harm to themselves or others. But most of the time it's specifically for an unconscious party that they think is a drug overdose.
Okay, so there are a couple ways that you find out about this. And could you walk us through, let's say somebody calls you directly, how does it work?
So we have two different ways of how we do it. So if someone calls us directly, that's why I mentioned the drug ingestion, because if people have called us directly, sometimes they're calling because an overdose is happening in real time, or they're worried that it's about to. It's kind of like this quasi alternative to the police, where if they're calling us directly, they might be afraid to contact 911. So they're trying to get to us first. So they call us on our phone number. We have a cell phone that's specifically dedicated for this line. So if that one rings, it's myself or the other dispatcher answers. We introduce ourselves as the dispatcher and basically kind of like a regular 911 operator. We try to get basic information such as location first and foremost, like what the situation is and what we can dispatch out. So if someone's calling me and saying it's a drug ingestion, or like, let's say someone has consumed like PCP, that's something where like Narcan isn't going to work. They might be in the road, things like that. So we might dispatch someone out in order to help with kind of like a de-escalation, as we're more accustomed to working with folks in those altered states. But it's mostly to specifically go out and try to get there before EMS and 911 for an overdose reversal. So we will reverse the actual overdose. So the first one is they call us, we get their information, and we immediately dispatch out folks, and we have a broadcast system for the city of Hartford. And then we stay on the line with them and kind of like close out with that person specifically if they're calling the line directly.
Okay, and so that's if they call you directly, because as you said, some folks don't feel comfortable calling 911, so they call you and then you respond, and eventually 911 does get contacted.
Yes, we do. We contact 911 if they haven't contacted 911. Because
right.
For us, we are not responding as medical professionals. So I'm not going to respond like an EMT or paramedic and try to pretend that I can come upon, let's say someone's not overdosing. If I'm responding to a medical emergency, I want to make sure that those who are qualified to respond also come with me.
Right. So it's more about having a friendly face on scene and someone with lived experience.
Very much so, because it's going to be probably over like 90-something% of our responders are folks with lived experience with drug use, specifically chaotic drug use at that.
Yeah. And so how does it work with the 911 scanners? Because that's a unique approach as well.
Yeah, so for us, overdoses are notoriously not called in. So historically speaking, and just for those of you who maybe aren't as familiar, a lot of drug overdoses occur where no one's calling 911, where those who are in the area are responding with Narcan if they have it. Luckily, we have a lot of folks that have Narcan in their hands. It's unfortunate that everyone has to have it, but a lot of times people respond. People who use drugs with one another are going to respond and have Narcan, and depending on the situation, aren't going to call 911. So we listen to the Hartford City Fire Department scanner as well, because fire department gets all calls. So that is a lot easier. And what it showed us is that we show up, oftentimes we're showing up before EMS or at the same time as them. So that's been really, really interesting. And then you get to know different areas of the city. I mean, for those of us who work in this field, we know our city really, really well. So we know areas that are kind of more prone to have maybe, let's say, like public overdoses and things like that, due to just where they're geographically located. So you get to kind of know that as you're dispatching over time. Like, okay, if I'm hearing an unconscious party and it's at 172 Washington Street, I know it's most likely an actual overdose because a lot happened at that address and at that apartment complex. So we respond if we hear unconscious party, or sometimes they'll say overdose, but depending on how people call it in, we're the ones who actually dispatch and go out. So that would be in conjunction with fire and EMS if they arrive, or if we get there before. But they know us all really well by now because we also worked with the local fire department as well as police department when we were starting this, and then just having everyone introduce themselves because it looks weird when you come up on scene and EMS are there and you're the one who's there, or we pull up in a car with it. So we all wear our badges and identify ourselves, and it's gotten a lot easier since then.
And that's actually part of the reason, and sorry to jump in, initially it wasn't that easy. So there were a lot of subsequent conversations with both fire and EMS, because initially they weren't sure who we were or why we were showing up. But once we were able to get a lot of those details worked out, and actually as a result of those conversations started Hartford's opioid task force. But then also we have people who are, will do a both and. They'll call 911 and they'll call us because they know we're, generally somewhere in one of those areas, Capitol Avenue, Broad Street, Park Street, Upper Albany. We'll get those phone calls as a both and in many cases, as Alex alluded, we may have somebody already out in the field, and it's a whole lot easier to get them there. So that's been a huge piece.
That's actually perfect timing too, because our drop-in center on Albany Avenue, Mark called this morning, we had an overdose that was right around the corner. And because of where we're at, a lot of people already know why we're here. So anytime there's one in the area, people will come to the drop-in center, say someone fell out, look for Narcan, and we respond both with that person. We have another staff person that calls 911. So that happened just a few hours ago, where someone came into our establishment and said, I need Narcan. So myself, another staff person, ran out with him and chased, followed him around the corner to where someone was overdosing, while our other staff called 911. And then we had our dispatcher that was on, so she dispatched it out, and we got to respond to it. So that way it's all logged within there. And this person was already Narcan and put into a vehicle by their friends to be brought to the hospital before EMS or anyone even arrived.
Yeah, so this is a really awesome example of grassroots from the ground up, and your both and approach, I think, is really, really important for people to understand that this is not an alternative. This is a supplement, that you are doing it alongside 911, because let's be honest, that 911 isn't able to get to overdoses as quickly as they should all the time. So,
well, they were actually, when we started, when I started first having these conversations with EMS and fire, they wanted to know, how were we able to get on scene so quick? How are we able to respond quicker than them in many cases? And just basically letting them know, we're out there. We get calls, and the way the system is set up, it will dispatch whoever is closest to that scene or whoever can respond. So it actually benefits. It benefits the people we serve. It saves lives.
Yeah. So as opposed to the other two, to SafeNest and Telecare, where they are designating specific responders to go, you're doing more of a, we'll call it a crowdsource approach, where you're blasting an alert out to a large number of your street outreach workers. Is that correct?
Yeah.
Yep.
So tell us just a little bit how that works. You send out alert to everybody, and then what happens next?
So, well, it's actually changed a bit since you all have made upgrades, which I sincerely appreciate for everything that's happened with it. So we worked with Jason specifically to kind of try to figure out how many people did it make sense for it to broadcast to. So Beacon has that broadcast option. And so what it is when we input it, we have a 3-person cutoff is how we decided that kind of worked best for us. And Beacon itself already will pick up on the GPS location of our dispatchers. So what I really like about Beacon now, especially, is how it'll say how far people are from it. It'll even pop up the directions of how to get to that location through the app as well as on the web. So it gets dispatched out, and then whoever responds quicker, those are the two that get sent, those 2 or 3 folks are the ones who then get sent to the actual location and then move forward through the process of the actual app and responding to it.
So then when they get on scene, if they're there before fire EMS, they administer Narcan. If they get on scene after fire EMS, are they of no use, or, what do they do?
No, so what they do is they engage the folks around them. So they're going to, depending on where they are, unless it's like some sort of like internal apartment inside of a building we can't get into, our folks always engage anyone in the surrounding community. It's a really good opportunity to talk about overdose recognition, as well as like how to respond and just getting more people aware of Narcan and how to get more Narcan to them. So oftentimes you'll engage the family, EMS, or maybe just those around the area. And it becomes a lot easier both for EMS to know us, but also for the community to know us more. And, if the community already knows us, then it gets a bit easier. So like, for example, the OD that happened was outside of a house. And we ended up giving 4 kits of Narcan to the house because they have a lot of people who use drugs who frequent that location. So things like that are really, really helpful, even if you aren't the one who actually administers the Narcan.
And then sometimes you just stand down. You stand back, and if they need you, they'll say, hey, do you know this, or do you know this person? Can you give us a hand? Or maybe not. Either way, we're not there to interfere. They're the first responders, and we just provide support anywhere we can.
So this is really interesting. My experience when I was working on the ambulance was that there were 3 choices for someone who had just had an overdose reversed. You could take them to the hospital, which oftentimes they didn't want to do. The police could take them to jail, or we would put them back on the street, offering no support services whatsoever, largely because that's not what we were trained to do. That wasn't within our scope. So what does Connecticut Harm Reduction Alliance do for someone who refuses transport to the hospital?
So I'll start with that. So if people are refusing to transport to the hospital, this is where I think like us being there is exceptionally helpful, because when you have Narcan administered, it's only temporary, and you have a really high probability of falling back either into an overdose, or you're feeling sick because you're in precipitated withdrawal. You might try to use, it's not going to work. It's a really high risk situation that someone's in. So what I really like about us having responders is we're able to engage the party and say, talk about risk reduction practices that they can engage in, what they can expect until the Narcan wears off and after it does, and getting them Narcan, getting them linked to services if they want. You don't want to overload someone with a whole bunch of resources and stuff after they just survived an overdose. But it's helpful for us because we're not the person with the sirens and the lights that shows up in a uniform. Like Mark said, it's more of a familiar face already. So I'll be honest, that really does it decreases a lot of barriers to getting folks help. So yeah, it's really just engaging the person, seeing where they're at and what they might need from us, and what best we can to keep them safe in them surviving that overdose.
Fascinating. So
that's what I forgot to say was the care package. I'm glad I remembered that. We had put together at first for emergency departments, but then also for responding to beacon calls, overdose care packages. So what happens is a lot of people get transported to the emergency department where all of their stuff is taken, seen as bio waste, and then they're left with absolutely no supplies whatsoever. And then when they leave, they have no supplies, depending on what time it is. They have no access to get more supplies. So you have a super high risk of someone that might engage in higher risk behaviors than they normally would because they're in a state of desperation. This is where you're seeing folks who might share a syringe or, use a found cooker or something like that puts them at higher risk. So we put together these overdose care packages that not only had Narcan, but that had resources, had syringes, had cookers and cottons and ties. So that way, just in case, if you're choosing that, what, I'm not ready to, stop my use altogether from this experience. If you choose to continue use, I want you to have your own stuff. It's all about harm reduction. How can I reduce these harms? So that is something else that we were able to provide.
Right. So you're providing these ongoing support services that police, fire, and EMS can't. So last question. I know you're a smaller outfit and you guys are spread so thin in all the different services you provide, but when the service is running, how many responses do you have on average, let's say per week?
So when all pistons are firing, like we have folks that can dispatch, it really, I'm going to say part of it depends not just on current drug trends, but also things like weather. Because with weather, you're going to have more public overdoses, like how I mentioned before, how a lot of these happen behind closed doors where no one's even contacted and nothing's called in. It tends to be, like in these warmer months when you just have more people outside that were receiving more calls. So that's one aspect for us that it depends on, as well as current drug trends. So for example, the other day, I had a cluster of overdoses that we dispatched out that were about 3 overdoses that I dispatched out within about an hour time period. But I also didn't dispatch out some different drug ingestions where people they were conscious, but maybe they were in the road, things like that we're not equipped to respond to for safety purposes. But stuff like that where you might have quite a few more depending on the batch. So for per week, I would say if we have everyone on, you're looking at about maybe, unfortunately, anywhere from 2 to 6 calls a day.
Right.
That you would have it for during our hours of overdoses. And for those of you that don't know Hartford, Connecticut, we're not that large of a city. So that might sound like a small number, but that's quite a few for those that are actually being called in and then dispatched out and responded to. So
Hartford's what, 125,000 people?
Oh my gosh, I feel like I have to look it up. Maybe Mark knows it and he'll tell me
That's
before
right.
I have to look it up.
That's correct, Jason.
It is? Okay, I was like, I was like, you or Mark will pop it and tell me. Yeah, it's not
Yeah.
that large.
No.
And that doesn't account for also though people who come into Hartford in order to get services or to get their products that they're then going to go home.
Yeah.
And use
It's
out
7 square miles.
7 square miles.
Yes.
Wow.
I
Okay.
work here and I didn't even realize it was that small.
Yeah. All right. Well, thank you very much. Again, such an impressive program and a truly life-saving service that you're providing. We really appreciate your taking the time to do this.